Today, we're continuing in this teaching on tithing. This is part 4, and it will be the last part. I promise, one way or the other, we're going to finish it today. This is going to be the last part, and we're going to start looking today and finish with the Brit Hadashah understanding. We want to look at, we looked at all of the tithing instructions already. We started at the beginning, really in Genesis, early on. We looked at the possibility that the Cain and Abel situation was a tithing situation, and we saw Melchizedek, and then we saw the Levitical. We saw a lot of things in the Old Testament, but now we're going to look at the Brit Hadashah understanding, and then I want to talk about reaping and sowing quite a little bit, and see what the scriptures talk about that, and then we'll wrap it up. Now, tithing is only specifically mentioned in the Brit Hadashah 5 times in 5 different places. And actually, one of the places really doesn't count as much because it's a parallel, so it's just repeating it in one gospel and then in another. And so we'll begin in Matthew 23, which is the first place we see that tithing is being talked about. Matthew 23, and we'll begin in verse 23. Now, Matthew 23, we're dealing with in this chapter a lot of hypocrisy issues. We're dealing with in this chapter a lot of self-aggrandizing and that kind of thing. And so let's start in verse 23 where he says, "Woe to you, you scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites." So we're dealing with this hypocrisy thing. "Because you tithe the mint and the anise and the cumin and have neglected the weightier matters of Torah, the right ruling and the compassion and the belief. These needed to have been done without neglecting the others." Okay, so let's stop there for a second. So what he's saying is this. Here's an endorsement of tithing. Not just tithing, but for those of you that wonder, how far do we need to take it? He's taking it even to the leaves of the small herbs. That's how much he's taking this tithing down to. He said these needed to be done. And so we could easily start to stretch out and try to find a way to be a minimalist and figure out what's the least you have to do. But here he's saying, look, you tithe even on the mint leaves and the anise and the cumin. These are herbs. He says, you even tithe on that. He said, that's good. It's good that you did these things. However, as a hypocrite, you neglected the weightier things. He says, you shouldn't have done the one and skipped the other. You should have done both. He's not saying you should have done the weightier things and skipped the tithing. He said both were necessary. And so this goes back to, are we becoming the type of person Yahweh wants to live with forever? What that person look like? It looks like Yeshua. And I think it looks like someone who is Torah observant, in other words, keeps the commandments as strictly as they can in the context of the weightier matters, which are the matters of the fruit of the Spirit, the matters of things like compassion and mercy and patience. And here he talks about the weightier matters of Torah, like the right ruling and the compassion and the belief, how we treat other people. He said, you're doing the things you can do yourself, like tithing on these little leaves. But what about the things that affect other people? Are you treating other people right? Because remember, the 2 great commands have to do with treating our Creator a certain way, and then the other one has to do with how we treat each other. And so he's trying to maybe link I'm guessing here, my interpretation is he's linking these things together here. So here he's mentioning tithing from the point of view of that, yes, we need to do these things, but let's not get so focused on those that we neglect the others as well. He goes in verse 24, he goes, "Blind guides, you're straining out of a gnat and you're swallowing a camel." So he's saying, look, when you're looking in whatever you're doing and you're making food and you'll take a strainer to strain out a little gnat that got in the food, but then you go and swallow a giant camel. It's a pretty strong metaphor. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are filled with plunder and unrighteousness. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish so that the outside of them becomes clean too. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites, because you are like whitewashed tombs, which outwardly indeed look well, but inside are filled with dead men's bones and all kinds of uncleanness. So you too outwardly indeed appear righteous to men, but inside you are filled with hypocrisy and lawlessness." So he's also warning us that once we start tithing, that we don't just do that for show. We don't just do that to be seen of men, which is a big part of chapter 23, earlier in the chapter, that they were doing things to be seen of men, but yet that we're doing these things because it's obedience and appreciating blessings and all of the things we taught in the first 3 parts of this thing. So he's saying here, because otherwise you're doing stuff for outward appearance, meanwhile inside you're a mess. And you can hide that pretty good most of the time. Unless somebody gets close enough to you and spends enough time with you, you can get away with just about anything in terms of how you want to project your outward appearance and pretty much hide a lot of stuff that's going on inside. And he's saying, don't be a hypocrite. He wants us to be congruent. He wants us to be the same inside and outside. As a matter of fact, we're told out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. That's why when people are being hypocrites, they have to be extra careful about what comes out of their mouth, because it's hard to prevent what's inside from just coming out naturally. And that's why there's lots of times, when you're with somebody and all of a sudden, one of the phrases I've heard is somebody just belched something or burped something out there, something they didn't intend to say, but gave you some real clear insight as to where they're really coming from or how they really feel about you. Something will come out. Why? Because out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth is going to speak. And if you have enough of time and enough relationship and enough conversation, the truth is going to come out. And so he's saying here, don't be a hypocrite. Tithe of the mint, the anise, tithe of all the little leaves, tithe of everything, but also don't neglect the weightier matters. Give equal attention to all. It's just as important to keep Shabbat as to be patient, to keep the feast as to have mercy and compassion, to eat properly with the kashrut as to have love and joy. It's just, in other words, take the fruit of the Spirit, match them up with the 10 Commandments. Now, there's 9 of one and 10 of the other, but still, the idea is match them up. I don't mean match them up one-on-one, but just understand that you need to be not giving more attention to the one than the other. That's the fullness of it. Okay, that's the fullness, the completeness of the picture that we're supposed to be getting here. Now, I'm not going to read Luke 42, but Luke 11:42, Luke 11:42 says exactly the same thing as Matthew 23. So that's the second place that it's listed. Now let's go to Luke 18 and verse 10. Luke 18 and in verse 10. Like I said, Luke 11 just was the same quote here about the tithing and the weightier matters. But now let's go to Luke 18 and in verse 10. Two men went up to the set-apart place to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and began to pray with himself this way. First of all, notice what he did. He's praying with himself. I think that's a very interesting phrase right there. Sometimes you can miss that. He's praying with himself because he's feeling only good about himself. He's totally into himself. He's all excited about what he's doing and thinks everybody else should be as well, including his Creator. So he's praying with himself. Doesn't say he's praying to Elohim. He's praying with himself. But he's going to use the words to say, Elohim, I thank you. I thank you that I'm not like the rest of men, swindlers, unrighteous, adulterers, or even this tax collector. He said, I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I possess. So here he's bragging. Now, of course, he didn't brag about doing anything wrong. He's bragging about doing things that are right. Of course, the bragging part's where he's wrong. He's feeling self-righteous. He's feeling superior. He's got this pride and ego problem. And he's doing what we talked about in Matthew 23, which, by the way, if Matthew 23 is paralleled in Luke 11, then this is after Luke 11, so we already have that instruction being received about not exalting yourself and not forgetting or neglecting the weightier matters. And so that, remember, was the issue in Matthew 23. And so now he's saying here, he's giving an example of someone who's exalting self. He's exalting self. So it's not that tithing is a problem, but again, this is one of the only other places where the tithing is mentioned in the New Testament. But then we get the tax collector standing at a distance, verse 13. He wouldn't even raise his eyes to the heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, Elohim, show favor unto me, a sinner. He says, I know I mess up. I know I don't know what I'm doing right. And I'm asking that you would, in your mercy, and here the word would be mercy, not grace, but the idea of mercy. Okay, so let's make sure we're translating it correctly. This would be mercy. He says, show mercy to me, because I know I don't deserve it. Mercy is unmerited. A sinner. But basically he's repenting. He's declaring his sin. Remember we talked about that was one of the things you need to do was to be able to declare. He's declaring his sin. And Yeshua says, I say to you, this man went down to his house declared right rather than the other. For everyone who is exalting himself, see, there's the issue, shall be humbled, and he who is humbling himself shall be exalted. So this man was declared right, not because of grace, but because he humbled himself. He was willing to admit his weakness. He was willing to admit his error. He was willing to admit being wrong. And he was beating his breast as a sign of saying, I deserve nothing. And I'm asking for mercy. And so here, in verse 15, he says, and they also brought, I don't want to go to verse 15. He's starting another thought there. So now let's take that idea and realize that this is the whole point that we want to make sure that we're not getting into. We've talked about why you need to tithe, what tithing does, what's the importance of it, but also bear in mind that doing it should never be a reason to self-exalt. Don't feel better than someone else because you do and they don't. Don't let what other people do have anything to do with whether or not you do it or how it reflects on what you're doing. Don't exalt yourself. I tithe, they don't. Well, good for you. It's not good for you if you're bragging about it, if you're exalting yourself. It's good for you if you're just being obedient and in humbleness just say, I do because that's what you asked me to do. Not because it makes me something great, not because it makes me exalted in any way. I'm simply being obedient and trusting that that is what you want to do and it brings the things that you say it will bring. I'm appreciating blessings. I'm not doing it to hold myself above people. This person was doing those things in that way. Let's go to Hebrews chapter 7. And this is going to be interesting. I have something I may or may not touch here in Hebrews. I'll have to see how much time I have. And so bear with me that if I don't go further than where I stop, that I know a lot of issues are going to come up in the verses where I stop, taking forward. I may not have time to deal with those issues. They're not about tithing, so it's not necessary that we go there, but we'll see. Hebrews chapter 7. That was my little preemptive strike here. We're going to begin in verse 1. Hebrews 7 and in verse 1. Okay? For this Melchizedek, sovereign of Shalem, priest of the Most High Elohim, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the sovereigns and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, his name being translated indeed first, sovereign of righteousness, and then also sovereign of Shalom. That is sovereign of peace. Now bear in mind that here we have another endorsement of the fact that it was Abraham giving tithe to Melchizedek. Because there are people out there trying to claim that Melchizedek gave something to Abraham. Well, he did. He brought the bread and the wine. That's what he gave for that. So now he says, also known as the sovereign of peace, the Prince of Peace, without father, without mother, without genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but having been made like the Son of Elohim, remains a priest for all time. Now let's stop for a second. Let's understand what's going on in the book of Hebrews. Now I've talked about this in the past, and I'm going to talk about it again now for a minute or two here, which is context, context, context. If you don't have context, you have no idea what you're looking at. So sometimes you need to read 3 or 4 verses before where you're reading to get context. Sometimes you might have to read a chapter. Sometimes you got to read the whole book. But one of the questions you may always need to understand is who's speaking. Now, right here, we're not really sure exactly who's speaking. We don't know who really wrote the book of Hebrews. But what we do understand here is that the speaker, we need to now know, why is he even speaking? What's the issue? What's he addressing? What's happening here is the book of Hebrews is written to, we don't know who the writer is, but who's the audience? Let's see, this is a tough one. Hebrews. That was tough. Okay, so he's got a Jewish audience. And so he's writing to the Jews, and what is going on when this is happening? Most likely the siege of Jerusalem. The temple and everything else is about to go bye-bye. See, we don't understand sieges today. You don't see that happening anywhere on the planet, really, sieges. Well, guess what? That happened a lot in those days and earlier, and so people understood what a siege was. And when you were under siege, generally speaking, it was just a matter of time before you were done. Because they would starve you out or cut off your water or whatever it was, and eventually you would have to give up or just die. But once you were under siege, you pretty much knew it was over. So here was the siege of Jerusalem happening. The temple was about to go bye-bye. The priesthood was about to go away. And so the Jews, the Hebrews at the time, were in a very emotionally challenged place. They were upset, they were depressed, they were scared, they were panicky. What were we going to do? I mean, their life revolved around knowing the temple and the priesthood was there, sort of as an anchor in their society. Even though they were disobedient on a large degree, and even though they were not compliant to the laws and submissive to the Creator, they always had that symbol in the middle of their society that anchored them to know that at some point we'll get back to it, or at least we'll be okay because they're doing something. This was an important symbol for them. And so here the writer is trying to say to them, I know this is happening, and I know you're afraid, but there's no reason to be afraid because we have another priesthood. A priesthood that always existed, a priesthood that was always available, a priesthood that goes back before there even was a Levite priesthood. And so listen to what he says here. He says, now this is where we get all bogged down and confused. He said, this priesthood, or this high priest, when it talks about it, it says, has no father or mother or genealogy, nor beginning of days, nor end of life, but is made like the Son of Elohim, remains a priest forever. So what is he talking about here? If we read further on, which we're going to see, how do you get to be a Levitical priest? This is tough. You got to be a Levite, which means your genealogy matters. How do you get to be a Kohen or a high priest? You've got to be not only a Levite, but you got to be from the line of Aaron so that your genealogy matters. What do you have to be a priest of the order of Melchizedek? Do you need genealogy for that? No. That's all he's saying. He's trying to make a point here because before he makes a case for Yeshua being high priest, that's going to be a tough argument if people are only thinking Levitical because he wasn't Levitical. So therefore, he has no qualification to be high priest in that order. So let's understand what the book of Hebrews is talking about when we get here to chapter 7. Continuing. And truly, verse 5 now, okay. Actually, we'll go to verse 4. Now see how great this one was, to whom even the ancestor Abraham gave a tenth of the choicest booty. So here's Abraham tithing to him. And truly those who are of the sons of Levi, who receive the priesthood, have a command to receive tithes from the people according to the Torah, that is, from their brothers, though they have come from the loins of Abraham. However, the one whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham, and bless the one who held the promises. He's trying to show not only do we have a priesthood, but that priesthood is to be treated the same and can receive tithes. As a matter of fact, that priesthood received tithes before Levi even received tithes. You see Melchizedek receiving it way before there even is a Levi, because this is Abraham, before he's even got the children to lead down generations to there being a Levi. So continuing here, he's trying to say, look, this is also a priesthood, and it's also one that can receive tithes. He says, let's continue. Where are we now? Okay, so we'll go back to verse 6. However, the one whose genealogy is not derived from them received tithes from Abraham and blessed the one who held the promises. So Abraham held the promises. Abraham gave tithes to Melchizedek. Melchizedek then blessed Abraham who held the promises. This is what the priesthood does. And it is beyond all dispute that the lesser is blessed by the better. In other words, there was a I don't want to say superiority in like self-aggrandizing. There was actually a superior position of the Melchizedek to Abraham. He was high priest. He held a higher position. And so the blessing came from the higher to the lower. From the higher to the lower. And here it is, men who died that receive tithes, but there is someone of whom it is witnessed that he lives. So now he's trying to say, look, this is a priesthood that has always had mortality. The Levitical priesthood has always had men, human beings, and they eventually die. And he's trying to make a case. Now remember, the whole point of all of this is to make a case for Yeshua and for those that are priests in that order under Yeshua, and to make a case for them receiving tithes. That's the point here. The point that Christianity makes out of it is that proves that the Old Testament's no good and the New Testament's so much better and all this other stuff. That's not what's going on here. This is purely about understanding a shifting of priesthood. Now let's continue. He says here, and here it is men who die that receive tithes, but there it is someone who is witness that he lives. And one might say that through Abraham, even Levi, who received tithes, gave tithes, for he was still in the loins of his father when Melchizedek met him. So even what he's saying is that even generationally, it's almost like Levi was tithing to Melchizedek, the higher of the two. The superiority in the Melchizedek. By the way, I have made an argument, and you know this when we've talked about this in the past, that Moses was of the Melchizedek, where his brother Aaron was the Levitical. Which one had more authority? Which was the superior in that relationship? Moses. The Melchizedek always held the higher position than the Levitical. So this is nothing new. Just so you know, what you're reading here is something that they could have understood, knowing their Tanakh, knowing their Chumash, knowing the first 5 books. They would have understood these things. He says, truly then, if perfection were through the Levitical priesthood, verse 11, for under it the people were given the Torah, why was there still need for another priest to arise according to the order of Melchizedek and not according to the order of Aaron? Now, the rest of this is about comparing what would bring perfection. That's not to say something wasn't useful, didn't serve a function, but the particular thing we're talking about now is that which can bring perfection. Can bring perfection. He says, for the priesthood being changed, okay, so a change from Levitical to Melchizedek, of necessity there takes place a change of the law also. Okay, so what law are we talking about here that changes? Okay, the law isn't changing like being done away with here. The shifting is that it's an ordinance. By the way, some books might say Torah in the translation. The Greek simply means the change of an ordinance, of an understanding of how an ordinance is applied. And what's being talked about here is the tithing. And so now that you have a different priesthood, the tithe is going to go to that priesthood because it won't be a Levitical one. So naturally, there's a change in priesthood. Old priesthood is leaving because it's being wiped out. Not because they're leaving, but they're being wiped out. The new priesthood is in place. Those that are of the Melchizedek. What is the Melchizedek? The Melchizedek or Melchizedek priesthood is one of discipleship and teaching of Torah. You see, that's exactly what Yeshua spent his life on earth in the flesh doing, wasn't it? Teaching and discipling. What was Moses doing? Teaching and discipling. That was their role. If you dig into it deeper, you'll see that Melchizedek also was part of, Melchizedek, whom Abraham was with, was Shem. Shem was part of teaching Abraham and also his children Torah, teaching them about Yahweh, teaching them about their vertical relationship and how things are supposed to be done. That's the role of the Melchizedek. So he says here again, for the priesthood being changed, there takes place necessarily a change in the law. In other words, this is dealing with the tithing that was talked about earlier. For he whom it is said belongs to another tribe from which no one had attended at the altar. See, this is also a change in understanding that we have a shift in our focus that the high priest now is a Melchizedek high priest, not a Levitical high priest. Because it's saying here, for he of whom this is said, okay, so who are we talking about? Who's the he of whom this is said? Yeshua belongs to another tribe from which no one had attended at the altar. In other words, the altar attending is only Levitical. For it is perfectly clear that our master arose from Yehuda. Now we know for sure that's who we're talking about. He's talking about Yeshua. Came from Yehuda, a tribe about which Moses never spoke of concerning priesthood. So what changed here? A change in our understanding of what it takes to be the high priest. There was no other doing away with any other law. This is only about understanding the specifics of priests and our interaction with them. Is that clear? Can we see where Christianity has totally made a mess of this? It's absolutely 100% consistently about the priesthood and specifically the high priest. That's all we're talking about here. We're not talking about anything else. We're not talking about kashrut or Sabbaths or feast days or any of those things. Simply about understanding priesthood. Okay, that's the context here. And in this chapter, that's all he's been talking about is absolutely 100% Levitical versus Melchizedekian priesthood. That's all we're talking about. He said, and this is clearer still if another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become not according to the Torah a fleshly command, but according to the power of an endless life. So he says, look, he's not our high priest because of the fleshly command, or the command that we deal with in our physical lives of having to be a Kohen of Aaron's blood, or a Levite of Levi's blood, but having been of the power of, it says here, the endless life. For he does witness, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. That comes from Psalm 110 and verse 4. He says, for there is indeed a setting aside of the former command because of its weakness and unprofitableness. Ah, there we go. The former command was weak and unprofitable. Hold your thought there for a second. Let's drop down to verse 28. For the Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath, which came after the Torah, appoints a son, having been perfected forever. So what was weak? The law or the men? But does that get taught to you on Sunday? No, you're taught that the law was weak, weren't you? Oh, no. Look what it says here. It says, for indeed a setting aside of the former command. So what are we setting aside? What's the former command being set aside? That you have to be a Kohen or a Levite to be priest. Well, that's being set aside. Not done away with, not nailed to the cross, no longer functional. And so he's saying that former command being laid aside, now he's saying, look, the Torah perfected nothing, but the bringing in of a better expectation through which we drew to Elohim. And it was not without an oath. So now the argument he's making here is that the people, the men who implemented were weak, they were fallible, they were flawed, they were awful at times. I mean, the priesthood did some awful things and led them astray and did all kinds of other things they shouldn't have done. He said, so I'm going to take this all the way to 28, which I said I wasn't sure if I was going to have time for, but we'll do it anyway. He says, for the Torah perfected nothing, but the bringing in of a better expectation. So in other words, just because Torah existed didn't mean automatically everybody was going to be perfect. Can we all agree that that's true? I mean, you all know how to keep Torah, and none of you is perfect. You all mess it up on a regular basis. See, so Torah in itself didn't perfect anything. He says, but it did give us a better expectation, didn't it? Okay, so we have that. And it was not without an oath. For they indeed became priests without an oath, but he became priest with an oath by him who said to him, Yahweh has sworn and shall not regret, you are a priest forever according to the order of Melchizedek. By as much as this Yeshua has become a guarantor of a better covenant. Okay, so I will agree 100% that he is the guarantor of a better covenant. But let's understand something. I can give you let's say I give you a $800 car and it works and it will get you from point A to point B. I could also give you, say, a brand new car. Can we agree that the first car worked, but the second car is better? Okay, so that doesn't make the first car no good. The first car had a purpose. You know, I remember being a young teenager, and we have what's called transportation as opposed to a car. Okay, that's what you first buy is transportation, something that will work. You don't care what it looks like. As long as it gets you from point A to point B, that's transportation. Later on in life, you may have the affluence or the ability to buy something nicer. Now you buy something because you like the way it looks. You didn't really care what it looked like the first time, though. You wanted to just make sure if you got in it, it would start and take you to where you're going, and then start again and take you home. That, you loved it. It was great. You appreciated it. It served a purpose. Yet if I gave you a new one is better. And so let's understand what it's talking about here. He says, look, by as much as this Yeshua has become a guarantor of a better covenant. Better why? Because he is not like these weak men. That's what we're going to read again in verse 28. The weakness is in the people implementing that which is perfect. The law was not the problem. The covenant was not the problem. The people that were standing in the breach were the problem. Mostly because they weren't standing in the breach. They were hiding behind it or whatever else they were doing. But we have a guarantor who is perfect, and will not fail and has no weaknesses. That makes it better. So it's better because of him, not because of the law changing or the law being done away with or anything to do with the law. The only thing that's changed is the priest, and the priest makes it better because he sets a perfect example. He does everything right. He never fails. He lives forever. He's not frail, weak, or flawed. So all we're doing is describing the difference between the Levitical and the Melchizedekian priesthood, the sons of Aaron versus Yeshua here. And that's the part that makes it better. Think of it this way, like, I don't know why this just came to me, but you know what? If you have a sports team, can't you bring in a star player and that player can make the team better? Didn't change the rules, but elevated everyone because he was better. That one player was better. And then if that player is a really good player, instead of just being exalting himself, he can elevate everybody else around him to be better. The sport didn't change. The rules of the game didn't change. There was the one person coming in that made it better. Here, the same thing. Yeshua makes it better. It's not because the one was thrown out, all the laws and everything else, and new laws were brought in. Because that's never being discussed in here. All that's being discussed in here is priesthood. Let's continue. And indeed, verse 23, those that became priests were many because they were prevented by death from continuing. So in other words, they kept dying off, and they had to bring a new priest, and they would die off, they had to bring a new priest. And so guess what? Every time there was a change of the guard, so to speak, you never knew what you were going to get. Some were better, some were worse. Some were better, some were worse. You don't have that problem with Yeshua. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. We have a high priest that doesn't change. Amen and amen and hallelujah. That makes life a whole lot better. He says, but he, who's the he here? Yeshua, because he remains forever, has an unchangeable priesthood. See, there's the key word. It's unchangeable with him. It was changing all the time with those that could die. The law didn't change. The quality of the leader changed because they were mortal. They were fleshly. Therefore, verse 25, therefore he is also able to save completely those who draw near to Elohim through him, ever living to make intercession for them. So this is not about saving, it's about saving completely. In other words, the Levitical priesthood only could help you so far. And a lot of that limitation had to do with there being fleshly people doing it. But Yeshua can save us completely. For it was fitting that we should have such a high priest, kind, innocent, undefiled, having been separated from sinners and exalted above the heavens, who does not need, as those high priests did, to offer up slaughterings day by day, first for his own sins and then for those of the people. For this he did once for all when he offered up himself. Now, by the way, let's understand that verse. That verse isn't saying that he did away with the sacrificial system. Listen to what it says. The high priests of Levi, the high priests that are given in the instructions at Sinai, had the affliction called weakness of flesh and sin. They sinned. So when they would come in, they had to make an offering for themselves first before they could do anything else for anybody else. He's saying Yeshua never has to do that because he's not a sinner. Yeshua gave himself once for all, and that was it. So we're talking about the effect on what priests do had nothing to do with the sacrificial system here. It's simply saying, let's read it again. He does not need, as they did, the high priests, to offer up a slaughter offering day by day, first for his own sins and then for those of the people, for he did this once and for all. He doesn't have, in other words, we don't need a temple with him, is what he's saying. Because this is now when the temple's going bye-bye. He can function without one. That's all it's saying. It's not saying the temple system was no good or was nailed to the cross. He's saying at this point, stop panicking. We don't need one because what he does doesn't need one. So we're going to be okay. He says, for the Torah appoints as high priests men who have weakness, but the word of the oath which came after the Torah appoints the Son, having been perfected forever. Are we getting this now? Are we getting this now? Now, what does this have to do with tithing? Well, it has to do with the idea in the beginning of the chapter that this new priesthood, which really isn't new, it's actually older than the other one, absolutely is worthy and qualified to receive tithes. Because the people out there are making a very strong argument, well, without the Levites and the priests, we don't have to tithe anymore. Well, tithing predates Levi and priests of that order. The priests get the tithe, whether it's Melchizedekian or Levitical. We don't have Levitical right now. Guess who gets the tithe? The Melchizedek one. So now you got to find out and figure out where's the Melchizedek priesthood so you can give them the tithes and offerings. And I'm telling you that as far as I understand it, and hopefully you see it too, it's the one who's discipling and teaching you Torah. Because that's what Yeshua did, and that's what he trained his students to do. He says, go out and do what I have done, disciple the nations. He didn't just say teach and share the good news. He said, go make disciples. That's a very strong, intimate teaching relationship, teacher-student relationship. That's the ones who should be getting your tithe and your offerings. All right. So hopefully that made some sense. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Like I said, there's only a few places here in the New Testament. 1 Corinthians chapter 9, we're going to read in verse 1. Am I not an emissary? Am I not free? Have I not seen Yeshua Messiah, our Master? Are you not my work in the Master? If to others I am not an emissary, I certainly am to you. For you are the seal of my office of the emissary and the Master. My defense to those who examine me is this: do we not have a right to eat and drink? Do we not have a right to take along a sister, a wife, as do also the other emissaries and the brothers of the Master and Kepha? Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? So what's going on here? What's the context? Well, here is Shaul trying to make the case for what? Financial support. Full-time ministry. So it's not new, this problem. Shaul is trying to make this argument in this case. Am I not? He says, look, are Barnabas and I are the only ones who are not allowed to refrain from having a secular, worldly job so that we could do this full time? Now, notice what he's saying here very clearly, though. He's talking to a group and saying, I feed you. I don't feed everybody. You should be taking care of me. Notice what he says here. He says, look, if to others I'm not an emissary, I certainly am to you. You are the work that the Master has given me to do. That's why I tell people all the time, your tithe should go to the ministry that is feeding you, the ministry you call for counsel, the ministry that's doing all of these things, not just somebody you like their teaching one day. It's not just to be spread out amongst every teacher you happen to like to whatever degree. You can give them all the offerings you want. That's not where your tithe goes. Your tithe is to support the guy who fits into the category of, are you not my work in the Master? He says, hey, listen, others may say I'm not an emissary to them, but I certainly am to you. Continuing, he says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense, verse 7? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its fruit? Or who shepherds a flock and does not feed on the milk of the flock? Do I say this as a man, or does not the Torah say the same too? For it has been written in the Torah of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. Is it about oxen that Elohim is concerned? So here's a case for serving the financial needs and the physical needs of those who are feeding you, with the spiritual needs, with the guidance and the counsel and the instruction. He says, or does he say it because of us all? For this was written because of us, that he who plows should plow in expectation, and the thresher in expectation of sharing. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap material goods from you? See, I don't know that all of you have not experienced this yet. I don't know how many of you have, but I know all of you haven't experienced this yet. But one day, and I pray it doesn't happen, but it will, you're going to need somebody from the ministry at an hour that normally somebody would not be available who had a regular job. And when that moment comes, and that person's not available, you'll understand this completely. Or when that moment comes and they are available, you'll understand this completely, if that person is full-time. But you know what? You are, in some ways, spoiled and blessed because you have myself and Robert and Rabbi Tom, who's retired, available to you all the time. But you know what? There's a lot of people out there whose leadership is not full-time. They have to go and punch that clock 9 to 5 or whatever their hours are, 40 hours a week plus, and they're not available to you when you need them. And we talked about that tithing allows them to also then be available to not only meet your needs, but to be strengthened in the Torah. Remember we read that in a previous part? So here Shaul is making this argument. He says, look, if we've sown spiritual seed among you, in other words, if we're there discipling and counseling and answering your questions and guiding you in the way that you're supposed to go, is it too much if we reap food, shelter, clothing, physical things, material things? If others share authority over you, should not rather we? But we have not used this authority, but we put up with all lest we hinder the good news. In other words, we're going to do what we need to do no matter what you do. But should you not participate in all of this? Isn't that something that you should be willingly and excitedly participating in? After all, you benefit. I kept, from the beginning of the tithing teaching, I've tried to make an argument that this is for you. I know that's going to sound very self-serving to some of you. Oh, yeah, you're going to put this big spin on it, but you get the money. No, you get all the benefit of what it does. I get a small benefit of what it does. And trust me when I tell you that the benefit to me, which means I have food and shelter and everything, doesn't outweigh the fact that instead of working 40 hours a week, I work, 300 hours a week. Well, there's only 168 hours in a week, but you understand what I'm saying. Okay, except for sleeping, I'm pretty much available always. And trust me when I tell you, there are people that will contact this ministry as early as 6, 7, or 8 in the morning and as late as 2, 3 in the morning as well. And all day in between. I would say easily between Robert and myself, we spend a good 4 hours plus to 5 hours a day just in counsel. Just answering people's questions and guiding and helping them with the stuff that's in their life that is causing them challenges. And that's both of us getting calls because the phone rings, and we have cell phones, and one way or the other, we're both on the phone all the time. And that need is only growing. Paul understood that, but that's why I'm trying to make this argument in case that this is for you. I'm not giving you a health wealth gospel. Do this so you can be wealthy. No, do this so that you have the things you need. You're going to need someone to be there when you have issues, when you have challenges, when you need guidance, when you have questions, when you need help. Do you not know that those serving the set-apart place eat from the set-apart place, verse 13, and those attending at the altar have their share of the offerings of the altar? So also the master instituted that those announcing the good news should live from the good news. That's the Melchizedekian switch from the Levitical. Is this making any sense? All right. Let's go now to Galatians chapter 6. I want to talk a little bit about reaping and sowing, and then we're going to bullet point this thing and end it with some highlights. But go to Galatians chapter 6. I want to talk about, because all of this stuff that I was just saying about is for your benefit, is because it's part of the laws of reaping and sowing. Galatians 6, and we'll begin in verse 1. Brothers, if a man is overtaken in some trespass, you the spiritual ones, set such a one straight in a spirit of meekness, looking at yourself lest you be tried too. Bear one another's burdens and so complete the Torah of Moses. For if anyone thinks himself to be somebody when he's not, he deceives himself. So first of all, he's talking about setting people straight. Believe me, he says, do it in meekness. Don't be setting people straight saying, oh, I'm smart and I'm going to set you straight and you're wrong. We see this a lot in the body. Stop doing that. As a matter of fact, if you want to be in the safest place, bring it to the attention of leadership. Let correction come from leadership. Because if you try to correct somebody, one of the first things the person is going to do is look at you like, well, who are you to tell me? Who are you to talk to me like that and straighten me out? What about the plank in your eye? So that's why he says, do it in the spirit of meekness, looking at yourself lest you be tried. In other words, be careful that you're not failing the plank twig test before you straighten anybody out. And be careful that you're not thinking yourself somebody when you're not. You're deceiving yourself. He says, but let each one examine his own work, verse 4, And then he shall have boasting in himself alone and not in another. For each one shall bear his own burden. You all have to bear your own burden. And let him who is instructed in the word share in all that is good with him who is instructing. There's that verse there that matches up with what we just were reading in 1 Corinthians, which is also consistent with the ox also eating while it's working, right? He says, do not be led astray. Look at the context of this. I could have just started in verse 7. Elohim is not mocked. Whatever man sows, he shall also reap. But notice the context of it has to do with thinking yourself more than you are, not doing things in meekness, exalting yourself, not examining your own work first and worried about, everybody else's burden instead of focusing on what you need to do. He says, because you're going to reap what you sow. Elohim is not mocked. You're going to reap what you sow. And he now links all of that to taking care of those instructing. Take care of those instructing. You'll reap what you sow. Bless those who are a blessing to you. You'll reap what you sow. Because he who sows to his own flesh shall reap corruption from the flesh, but he who sows to the Spirit shall also reap everlasting life from the Spirit. Now let's deal with the Spirit again as being what? The fullness of what Abba intended. If you're going to do the fleshly things, that's what you intend, not necessarily what he intended. But when you sow to the fullness of what Abba intended, you're going to reap everlasting life. When you are congruent with what the manufacturer designed you to do, you reap everlasting life. This is your instruction manual. It tells you how to do that, how to do what you were designed to do and do it correctly. And that reaps everlasting life. Let's not turn this into some Christianese spiritualizing, ethereal thing. He's simply saying, when you do fleshly things, it's going to reap that of the flesh. It's not going to reap life, it's going to reap death. But when you do spiritual things, or the things of above, the commandments, the instructions that all come down from above, that reaps everlasting life. It's not complicated. Let us not lose heart in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not grow weary. There's the problem, though. He says, you'll reap if you don't grow weary. In other words, you're not going to reap immediately, necessarily. I mean, sometimes you reap very quickly and things happen, but not often. You have to be found so doing. Well done, you good and faithful servant, because you were found so doing. Not because you feel like, oh, look, I reaped. Okay, I'm happy now. Nothing more to do. But don't grow weary. Why would you grow weary? Because it hasn't reaped yet. You haven't gotten what you were hoping to get yet. And so you can lose your zeal. You can lose your first love, and you start to, complacency will kill you. Or that weariness will kill you. You have to be full on. We read this earlier in the teachings, the idea of, in the endure teaching, endure and receive the crown of life, the idea of you have to run the race, to finish the race, to win the race, to receive the crown. If you quit anywhere before that finish line, you still lose. I don't care if it's 1 inch before the finish line. If you stop, you lose. You have to run the race. One of the things I remember I was taught when I was on swim team. Okay, so I was in a competitive racing type of thing. We were always told to swim all the way through to the wall, not to slow down when you're 1 or 2 strokes before it, because somebody right next to you can just speed up that last second and beat you. You see this in the Olympics, you see this in competitive sports. The person who thinks he's got it all worked out and then slows down that last 10 yards or 5 yards, and somebody comes right up behind him and passes him. Run through the tape. Push through to the end. I used to teach martial arts, and when I taught, we used to teach the children to break the boards. That was always the big thing. Kids want to see if they can break a board. But you can't break one if you're hitting the board. You have to hit through the board. You have to aim beyond the board. Okay, so here he's saying, look, you can't grow weary. You can't stop short. You can't give in, give up, or slow down. Be on your guard. Be aware all the time. Whatever you're sowing, you're going to reap. Whether you reap it now or later, Elohim will not be mocked. You will reap. Do you believe that or not? That's the problem. If you don't believe it, you can grow weary and you can slack. You can become complacent. You can ease off the pedal, so to speak, and slow down. You can't do that. If you do that, the old you, the one that you thought you buried, will jump right in. And now you're going to be sowing fleshly things instead of spiritual things. And we have to be very, very aware that that is absolutely a problem. So he says here, so then, verse 10, as we have occasion, let us do good to all, especially to those who are of the household of belief. Very, very important, very important. We will reap what we sow. You know, Paul tells us in Romans 2, he says that we will reap what we sow. And he says some of us are going to reap everlasting life, and some of us are going to reap, condemnation and wrath. It all depends on what you sow. That reaping and sowing thing is a universal law. You're going to reap what you sow. Nobody gets away with anything. You may think you do, short term, but Yahweh assures us nobody gets away with anything. He says, otherwise, he would be mocked. It would be mocking him to let you do that. For someone to be allowed to get away with not reaping what they sowed is making a mockery of our Creator, and he will not be mocked. Let's continue in Luke chapter 6. Luke chapter 6. We're still on the reaping and sowing thing. In verse 27, but I say to you who are hearing, love your enemies and do good to those hating you. Bless those cursing you and pray for those insulting you. There's some reaping and some sowing going on. You know what? Does anybody out there have anybody that is an enemy or thinks of you as an enemy? Does anybody have those that hate you or those that are cursing you, those that are insulting you? Well, what if you were to pray for them? Maybe it would have an effect on how they treat you at some point. He says that to him who hits you on the one cheek, offer the other also. From him who takes away your outer garment, do not withhold the inner garment either. And give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away what is yours, do not ask it back. Well, that's a problem for most of us. Some of you aren't talking to some people you know because you lent them something and they never gave it back, and now you're all mad. Why would you lend it to them expecting to get it back? You should have always known the possibility was you're never going to see it again. Otherwise, why would you give it? Oh, no, now you're all mad. He says here, I think it's not ambiguous. I think it's very clear. It says, and don't give to anyone expecting to get it back. In verse 31, and as you wish men should do to you, you also do to them in the same way. And if you love those loving you, now, by the way, this is one of the only places where Yeshua mentions the word grace. And you can see quickly that it's not a doctrinal position. He simply says, if you only love those loving you, what grace is it? What grace do you have from that? What does that merit? You see? So let's put the word unmerited favor in there. If you only love those loving you, what unmerited favor have you? Well, you've unmerited, nothing merited there. For sinners too love those loving them. And if you do good to those doing good to you, what favor then do you have there? What grace is it there? In other words, it doesn't merit anything because grace is not unmerited, it's merited. He's saying you don't have any grace there because you only love those loving you, you haven't merited anything. It doesn't take any effort or any, you don't get a big gold star and nobody's proud of you because you just love those who love you. But what about loving an enemy, loving someone who's cursing you? How going in that level that takes, the Ruach, the Spirit? See, when we look at the fruit of the Spirit, love is the first one. If you only love those loving you, then you're not doing the fruit of the Spirit. Anybody in the flesh can love those who love them. The Spirit level is loving enemy, loving those who curse you, loving the ones that are so hard to love. I wonder if that's me. You ought to ask that question. Maybe you're hard to love too. Because it's so easy to think of that person. Well, that person, so I don't know, they make it so hard for me to love them. I don't know, are you making it hard for anybody to love you? Are you creating that challenge? And if you lend to those of whom you expect to receive back, what favor do you have? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive back as much. Rather, love your enemies and do good and lend, expecting none in return, and your reward shall be great, and you shall be sons of the Most High, because he is kind to the thankless and wicked ones. Now listen, that is our expectation there That's how we should be treating others, and then we will reap and sow. This is a reaping and sowing chapter right here. This little section is all about reaping and sowing. He says, therefore be compassionate as your Father also is compassionate. Do not judge, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, you shall not be condemned at all. Forgive, and you shall be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given to you a good measure, pressed down and shaken together and running over, shall be put into your lap. For with the same measure with which you measure, did you catch that? That's the reaping and sowing law. With the same measure with which you measured, it shall be measured back to you. How many parables do we have, like the talents, etc., where the person did a lot with it, or they did a little with it, or they did nothing with it? You're saying, Abba's given you all of these gifts and talents, the ability to be compassionate and loving and merciful, etc., and then you want everybody to treat you that way, but are you doing it? See, we like to think about the idea of, well, you sow your $1,000 seed, you get all this money back. Well, maybe you don't need money. Maybe you need to be treated nicer or to be cared about. Maybe you don't do that to others. Maybe if you go and sow more of that, you'll get more of that. See, what happens, though, when you don't get it, you tend to go hide in your house somewhere and ignore everybody and lock yourself up. Sow more, and you'll reap more of whatever it is. He says, don't judge, you'll be judged. See, if you judge, you reap judgment. If you're compassionate, you reap compassion. Whatever it is, you'll reap it. Forgive, and you'll be forgiven. He seems to be broad-stroking this pretty good. So I would be very comfortable broad-stroking it as well. Whatever it is that you want, desire, and need more of that you don't have, give more of it. Give more of it. Let's go to 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 6. I got to speed up a little bit. We're not going to end this thing. 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 6. And this, he who sows sparingly shall also reap sparingly. He who sows on blessing shall also reap on blessing. Doesn't that sound exactly what we just read? Let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not of grief or of necessity, for Elohim loves a joyous giver. And Elohim is able to make all favor overflow towards you, because then you'll merit it. You see, then he'll have it overflow towards you, that you, always having all you need in every way, have plenty for every good work. As it has been written, he scattered abroad, he gave to the poor, his righteousness remains forever. And he who supplies seed to the sower and bread for food shall supply and increase the seed you have sown, and increase the fruit of your righteousness, being enriched in every way for all simplicity, which works out thanksgiving to Elohim through us. Because the rendering of this service not only supplies the needs of the set-apart ones, but also is overflowing through many thanksgiving to Elohim. So he's basically saying, look, giving things and taking care of those who serve you is going to bring all these other blessings back to you. So let's break this down. He said, you reap what you sow. He says to give as you have purposed in your heart. By the way, when an opportunity to give pops up, usually the first number that pops in your head is the one you should use. Because what will happen is then you'll think about it, you'll make the number smaller. Anybody have that experience? But why did that first number pop in your head? That was what was purposed in your heart. Consider that. Not of grief or necessity, but you're doing it as a cheerful giver. Elohim loves a cheerful giver. And notice that he also said he provides seed to the sower. You can't outgive him. Give, and if that's what you want to be as a giver, he'll give you more. And he'll give you more. Maybe not directly by having it manifest spontaneously in your bank account or in your mailbox, but it'll open up job opportunities or situations where that you can have more seed to sow. Okay? And he says all of this works to bring thanksgiving to Elohim. That is how this all packages together. That all of this works to bring thanksgiving to Elohim. But notice it also has to do with, he says, if you supply the needs of the set-apart ones, then also overflowing through this is the many thanksgivings of Elohim. He says, supplying what each other needs merits favor. And so let's hopefully keep that all on. Remember, I said that this teaching was subtitled, Appreciating the Blessings. We tithe because we're instructed to, but we're also tithing as cheerful givers because we appreciate the blessings that he gives us, the many, many blessings that he gives us. All right, so I want to read a few things that I wrote that come from the first teaching, but just so that we have this kind of on record. I'm going to wrap things up together. Tithing versus giving. The tithe was the foundation of ancient Israel's economic system. It taught Israelites to always be aware that Yahweh was the provider of their needs and wealth, and that Yahweh provided that wealth to establish his covenant. We read that in Deuteronomy. We're going to close with that verse. That the reason that he gives us the wealth is to establish his covenant. And so how does it establish his covenant? Two ways. One is people see that we have abundance and want to know, how did we get it? And we can say, let me tell you about my Creator who gives me the abundance. But also, the covenant is about becoming his people and a nation, and that also takes the funds to establish the land and to build the community and all the other things that are necessary within that context. Tithing had three advantages. Okay, so people wonder, why did he invent the whole tithing system? Well, first of all, the three advantages are simplicity, consistency, and discipline, because after all, 10% is a very simple thing to figure out. I know some people have challenges. Maybe when they're at the restaurant, they're trying to think of a tip and they want to put in 15%. Well, that's a little bit more tough. Or maybe you're at the store and you've got a coupon for 15% off and you got to do that math. It's a little bit more tough. 10% is a very simple thing to do. So he gave us a very simple thing to do. And actually the way they did it was even less math to it. It was counting it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then the 10th one, boom, is his. I mean, it wasn't really tough to do. A very simple system. Consistency. Okay, so he expects you to do this all the time. It was something you were instructed to do. You can do it consistently. You did it every time that there was an increase that was there to be, that you could then tithe on. And discipline. It gave you something where he said, when you do these things, you're going to tithe on it. Not something where you'd have to remember and think, I wonder if I feel blessed, should I give an offering? See, an offering comes out of the abundance of your heart. Tithing was an instructed thing to do. So that's the kind of the introduction, which is why I call tithing giving for beginners. It starts the flow of the thinking in terms of giving. Now, of course, we read about other places where it had to do with, on top of the tithe was also the offerings. Okay, you have the truma on top of the maaser. Maaser is the tithe, truma is the offerings. From what we have looked at so far from Scripture, there are no taxes or dues or membership fees or other compulsory assessments to be applied to the believing assembly of Messiah, the Israel of Elohim. It always cracks me up, and remember, I was raised in the Jewish community, if you go to a synagogue, to a shul, and you go and say, I would like to join your synagogue, you can't believe what they charge for membership. But why do they charge membership? Because people aren't tithing. Because people aren't tithing. If their membership tithed to their synagogue, they'd never have to charge a membership fee. But you have to join a synagogue. That's the way the Jewish community generally works. I don't see anywhere in Scripture a membership fee or dues or taxes. The system is called tithing. The ministry of the local assembly and its efforts to, quote, preach the gospel and serve the body are supported as each member gives tithes and offerings as purposed in his heart, not grudgingly or under compulsion, but cheerfully out of the abundance of his heart. We know from what we've studied that whatever a man sows, he reaps. The traditional standard of 10%, the tithe, might be in some cases sowing sparingly. In others, it would be sowing bountifully. Let's use a simple example. Because some people think of tithe as being such a big deal. But let's put it in perspective. Because tithing may feel very different in these two different scenarios when we listen to how it plays out. Here's the example. Let's compare two men who have the same family structure. Okay, so they have the same amount of kids, husband, wife, whatever it is. Their family structure is exactly the same. One earns, say, $2,000 a month, which is roughly your $10 an hour person today. So this is one of those sort of very common places to be. And the other earns $4,000 a month. We just didn't bump it up too high, but that's another reasonably common place that you could be. The first gives $200, which is the tithe of the $2,000, and is left with $1,800 to live on. And the second one tithes $400 and is left with $3,600 to live on. The first gave greatly, you might think, because it might be a lot tougher to live on the $1,800 after giving the tithe than living on the $3,600 after giving the tithe. Of course, I can tell you that in some cases it's actually the reverse, because people with more money tend to get in more debt and have more bills and more extravagant lifestyles and end up getting themselves in more trouble, and they struggle harder on the $4,000 a month than the $2,000 a month person. That happens a lot. But if you think about it, That's why it's a beginning thing. Because the one with more that has the opportunity to give more, to make offerings, to do other things to help take care of what's going on. Having more doesn't mean you need to own more. You don't need to spend everything you get. You can have a very happy lifestyle without spending it all. Okay, you don't have to end up with no money at the end of the month. As a matter of fact, a lot of you would be very happy to just get to the end of the month with just enough to get you there. A lot of you end up with more month at the end of the money. And that's hard. Okay, so the first gave greatly. The second, depending on their financial situation and responsibility, might not have hardly noticed the difference. It just really depends. Remember, these are two families with the exact same structure. One ended up with twice the amount of money as the other one. And so let's not just think of tithing as the end-all, be-all of the whole thing. It's giving for beginners. It's going to give you that insight of what it's like to be a giver. Remember, we talked about the basics of the whole thing as Yahweh is the ultimate idea of giving. We were meant to be receivers who would change and become givers. And so this whole process is to teach us how to get there. Elohim himself is the model, the motivator, and equiper of all our giving. The giving of a portion of one's wealth is made in recognition that everything we have belongs to him. Giving one's tithes and offerings to Yahweh are an expression of our appreciation of all that Yahweh has blessed us with and all that he has promised to bless us with. So again, it's appreciating the blessings. That's why we do these things. Not just because he said so, but it expresses an abundance of our heart of appreciation. See, if you're not giving your tithe that way, then you're not appreciating what he's given you. If you're giving it reluctantly and begrudgingly, etc. The ability and motivation to give is a function of Yahweh's love in us. See, the more you allow him to function in you, the more you have no problem. Remember, it's his good pleasure to give us everything he gives us. In Yahweh's eyes, the attitude of the giver is even more important than the amount you give. We should give with joy, cheerfulness, generosity, sacrifice, eagerness, willingness, perseverance, and integrity. Remember, the integrity had to do with the person declaring what he'd done with the tithe. You know, the other day we got a tithe that came in, and I really appreciate this, but the gentleman who sent it in actually wrote in the memo, he declared all those declarations about what he did with that tithe, that he didn't do anything wrong. He decided he wanted to make that declaration. And I really appreciated it. I thought that was really, really cool that he did that. Okay, giving is a spiritual exercise in which all believers may participate, even poor ones. The widow's mite. Remember that? The value of a gift is not determined by its amount, but by its cost. The question should not be how much can I spare, but rather how much can I sacrifice? Not how much can I give, but how much can I give up? You know, in Luke 21, in verse 1 through 4, you know about the widow and her mite. She gave that out of the what? Out of her poverty. But that was her desire to give, even though she had almost nothing. And I'm not going to go back and read it, but that's in Luke 21, 1 through 4. You all know that story. And so let's be aware that it's not the amount necessarily, but where is it coming out of your heart? And what is it costing you? Is it putting you even more in a place where you got to trust him? Or is it just something you can do and you won't even notice it's gone? The believer is not expected to give more than he's able, however. Often, however, believers find that they can give more than they thought they could afford. Some, however, when it comes to giving, stop at nothing. I mean, like literally, they give nothing. That's where they stop, right at nothing. Okay, you can laugh now. It's okay. I'll say it again. Some, however, when it comes to giving, stop at nothing. They don't get any further than that. The ability to give is given by Elohim, who gives more to those who want to give more. I believe that completely. I've seen it. You've seen it. If you've done it, you know this is true. The opportunity to give should be viewed as a privilege and not an imposed obligation. The greatest threat to generous giving is not poverty, but covetousness. Remember that Yahweh gives us the wealth to establish his covenant. That's Deuteronomy 8 and verse 18. That's where we started, and that's where we're ending with that. Now, let me just say this as we wrap up. If any or all of this or any part of this freaks you out, panics you, or causes you any kind of stress, it's exposing one of two things. It's either exposing an income problem that you can address. In other words, you've just never pushed yourself in that area to get the income that would be necessary to take care of yourself, family, and everything else that you have needs for. It also may be exposing an emunah problem, a faith, a trust issue. And so this is good. If problems are exposed, they can be dealt with. If they're not exposed, you won't ever deal with them. You know, I know when people, for example, they'll have something hurting like a tooth or some other thing, and they're all afraid to go to the dentist. Like, why? Is it going to change the fact that it's there? Why are you afraid to go to the doctor? Well, I'm afraid he's going to tell me this. Is not going to make it go away and fix it? Exposing the problem is a good thing. Doesn't mean you have to like it and enjoy it, but now you can deal with it. Okay, my daughter got very nervous about this thing with her arm. So we're going to go to the doctor, but I've explained to her that whatever it is isn't going to go away, and we need to know what it is, and let's go find out. So there's no reason to be afraid to go to the doctor. Now, the doctor may tell you things that they would think that you should do, and you have a choice then to do what they say or not, but at least you can go find out what it is. And so we should not be afraid of the exposing of the problem. And so I'm finished here with the teaching now on tithing. What you now need to do is figure out how you feel about it, and then based on how you feel about it, is there a problem that was exposed? Are you excited? Are you anticipating with joy and cheer giving your tithes? Or does it concern you and make you nervous? And is there some sort of a covetous issue there? Or is there a trust issue, faith issue there? Or is it really exposing an income problem there? Or maybe you've got some leaks in your budget that you just have been too lazy to plug, or whatever it is. What is it exposing in you? I mean, this is one of those tests where he's going to get to know you a lot better based on how you deal with this. You are not going to hurt what he's trying to do financially by not participating. The only one you'll hurt is you. That's the key to all of this. If you could only truly embrace that the only one you hurt by not doing this is you. Father will absolutely fund whatever he wants to fund any way he wants, whether you participate or not. But you have an opportunity to participate. Does that make sense? Amen. Father, we come before you, and we studied out your word, and we studied about tithing and about giving and generosity. And Father, we do truly appreciate the blessings that you give us and all that you do. So Father, help us to look at our situation and how we deal with our finances and how they relate to how we are interacting with you and with those that you anoint and appoint. And Father, expose whatever needs to be exposed in us, whether it's a faith or trust problem, income problem, a covetous problem, whatever it is. If there's some problem in there, we can't allow that problem to stay. We need to grow and continue to transform into the image of Yeshua. And so all things that need to be fixed and changed and adjusted must be exposed and it must be dealt with. So Father, we thank you. We praise you. We appreciate that this is from you, that it's to establish your covenant, that it's an opportunity for us to participate in the work that you're doing, and that we can then grow in our faith and emunah and our trust. So, Father, again, we want to thank you and praise you, giving you all glory and all honor, asking that you strengthen us as we go forth in taking what you've taught us and applying it in our lives, as we come now in the name and authority of our high priest, according to the order of Melchizedek, Yeshua our Messiah. Amen. Amen. Amen.